Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the 18th Annual Housing Action Coalition Spring Symposium, sponsored by Suffolk. My name is Corey Smith. I am the Housing Action Coalition's Executive Director, and thrilled to welcome everybody here in the room and everybody watching online, which for the folks, it's right over there, to an afternoon focused on getting to yes for new housing. Today, our two panels of experts and policymakers are going to talk about the benefits, trade-offs, and all the factors really that go into new housing development. And if this is your first ever hack event, number one, welcome. Our spring symposium is an opportunity to discuss the policies that impact housing development around the entire state of California. And after today's discussion, I want to invite everybody here in the room and everybody watching online to join us at 111 Minna for a happy hour and a continued discussion. Before we get into the afternoon's topics, I do want to take a few minutes and recognize and thank some of the people and organizations that help make today happen. Already mentioned our presenting sponsor here today is Suffolk and Alex Baraki, who's a board member on our team. I also really want to extend my appreciation to the American Institute of Architects for hosting us here today at their beautiful Center for Architecture and Design. If you have not been to this space yet, downtown San Francisco at 140 Sutter Street, it is absolutely beautiful. I also want to take a moment and thank our density bonus sponsors, First Citizens Bank and Ruben, Junius, and Rose. We appreciate the longtime support from both organizations and appreciate their dedication to solving our affordability and displacement crisis. I want to thank our infill sponsors, David Baker Architects, Shepherd Mullen, AT&T, the Baylands Development, the Northern California Carpenters Regional Council, Macy Architecture, and 5 Point. And second to last, to the HAC staff and to Nico and the whole team for making this event happen. Along with Allie, Jake, and Miles, this is really a collaborative and collective effort. An additional shout out to Whit, Alex, Katie, and Rhett, who are helping us out here today. Your contributions to not just this event, but the organization as a whole really make us go. Last, the Housing Action Coalition Board. If you are a board member here in the room, raise your hand, right? We have, Alex and I actually talk about this often, and Alex gets to spend a lot of time working with many boards. And he's always said the HAC board and the setup that the HAC board has and the members are just off the charts impressive. And so it is all of you that allow me and the rest of the team to do this work. So thank you for your support, for your encouragement, and for all of you willing to push to make California a place for everybody. And with that, I would like to welcome up our first panelists, the chair of the Housing Action Coalition Board, Randi Gerson, and the Terner Center's Sarah Karlinsky to the stage here. So Sarah and Randi are going to set the stage for us today and make sure that everybody here understands the basics of development math. And this conversation is going to help set the stage for our second panel. If you have questions, please do one of two things. If you're on Zoom, use the Zoom Q&A feature. And then if you're in the room here, if we have time at the end, we'll just take a microphone around and be able to answer some questions that way. And with that, let us welcome Sarah for the opening presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. I'm Sarah Karlinsky. I'm with the Terner Center. I'm the research director. And I'm really, really excited to be here today to talk about development math. Before I get started, I just would like to thank HAC and thank Corey for having me. I really admire the work that you do. Followed this organization for a long time through various iterations and permutations, and I'm just so impressed with everything that you've done. So thank you. So I'm here today to talk about an important topic, that of development math. In 2019, the Turner Center released Making It Pencil, which is a brief on development math designed to be a resource to policymakers, to advocates, and others. Since 2019, a lot in the world has changed in real estate and otherwise, but we still need housing. So we decided to refresh our original Making It Pencil project. The update was completed by David Garcia, who's Turner's former policy director. If you remember him, he's a wonderful person. He's now with Up for Growth. And we were also assisted by Jonathan Fern and Charmaine Curtis. Some of you may know both of them, as well as the modeling, real estate modeling firm Mapcraft. So with this report and this presentation, I'm actually standing on the shoulders of giants. Is that better? Yeah. Like that? Like a kind of like rock, like a rocker, kind of like, except about math. All right, great, awesome, cool. Okay, so our plan for this session is to walk you through the updated development math work, and then Randy and I will endeavor to answer any questions that you may have. And I know a lot of you have a lot of expertise in this room, so we might end up throwing questions back to you. Kevin, I see you over there. You might get asked some questions. You never know what could happen next. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. So Making a Pencil as a series is really designed to be an explanatory tool for how development math works. It's really geared towards policymakers and the lay audience. We actually have a wonderful interactive tool on our website, which I'm hoping the hack folks could then just drop in the chat for those of you who are watching from home or from work. We also have a more detailed technical report, which is available on our website and super interesting, and I encourage you to check it out. So for this report, we created detailed financial analyses. They are called pro formas for a handful of key markets throughout the state of California. The other thing to know is that these are pro formas for market rate housing. And the reason that we focused on market rate housing is that the vast majority of new housing built in America today is market rate housing and has been for decades. This project also is informed largely by a set of case studies, and those case studies themselves are informed by conversations with developers in each of a variety of submarkets, as well as consultants and financial advisors. Basically, we went around and we talked to a whole bunch of different experts. And the markets we looked at were two markets in the Bay Area, one in the East Bay and one in the South Bay of San Francisco Bay Area, as well as the west side of Los Angeles and the core of Sacramento. And lastly, one thing I just want to emphasize is that while these are case studies of specific places, the math and the principles that we're going to be going over today are true for market rate real estate development more broadly. So really try to focus on the principles. All right. Why is development math important? It's important because you know, in the United States, as I mentioned, most of the housing that gets built is market rate housing, and therefore, if we can't build market rate housing, we're not going to have enough housing. So, if the project cannot be built privately, it is unlikely to be built at all. And what you can see from this chart here is that the amount of housing built in California is below the amount needed to keep pace with population growth, and also to address our decades-long chronic housing shortage, which has led to both high prices and also overcrowding. Once again, if the math doesn't work, the housing does not get built. We can also see that California is not doing particularly well, even relative to other states. California's housing deficit is particularly acute, with California well below other states in terms of the number of housing units produced per capita. Okay, so now we're going to get back to development math at hand and our core case studies. We know it's expensive to build, but what actually goes into those expenses? That's what we're going to talk about today. The components of new development that are the most expensive. It's also really important to break down who pays for these projects. Developers don't generally use their own money. In fact, I actually took a real estate development class. It was an affordable real estate development class when I was in grad school. And it was like a call and response situation where the professor would just say, whose money are you going to use? And then we'd always say, other people's money. And he's like, good, you got it. Other people's money. Do not use your own money. So that's like literally one of the only things I remember from grad school, which is kind of terrifying pedagogically. But anyhow, we can continue on. So when we're talking about using other people's money, each of these sources has different return expectations that a developer must meet in order to obtain financing. So we're going to look at that. And then we're also going to look at how rents are determined and what role they play in project feasibility. And lastly, because we have some policymakers in the room, we'll look at what policymakers can do to change this map. Okay, so welcome to our development. It is called, belovedly, Terner Terrace. So we are going to focus on this specific case study, and let's talk about what we need to know about this project. So first of all, as I mentioned before, it's market rate. All of the units are set at market. There is no subsidy or on-site affordability as part of the project. It is located in the East Bay in a strong market location. So you should think of like Emeryville or Uptown or Rockridge. The project is 120 units. The parking ratio is 1 parking stall per unit. There's a little bit of retail on the ground floor, enough for a little coffee shop. And perhaps most importantly, when we're thinking about math, is that Terner Terrace is a mid-rise, or something known belovedly as a 5/1, which basically means that there's a concrete podium with multiple floors of wood frame construction above. And it's particularly important to know this because the way that the building is constructed has a really important relationship with how much it costs. For example, if this project were a high rise, it would be built with concrete and steel, and therefore would be much more expensive. But Terner Terrace is actually more expensive than like a single family home or a townhome, which would be less expensive. Let's talk a little bit now about the site, because that's also very important. So here are the series of assumptions we used. And I just want to mention also at the outset that these assumptions are relatively rosy. The idea being that we want to show a baseline. And then I think when I get to the end of the presentation, it'll be clear why we chose this baseline. So first of all, it's a clean site. There's no demolition. There's no existing building that needs to be knocked down. There's no environmental remediation. So that means that there's no underground storage tanks or contaminated soil or other yuckies that need to be taken away or dealt with. The project has received streamlined environmental clearances under CEQA, and that is either because the city we're working in does not require a more robust environmental review, or because the project has accessed an exemption of some kind. Impact fees are roughly $40,000 a unit. These are for things like school districts or municipal utility district fees. And as we'll get into a little bit later, the amount of these fees per unit can vary very widely across various jurisdictions. As I mentioned earlier, there's no inclusionary, there's no commercial linkage fee, there are no additional exactions. And so what we determined is that the land would cost about $8 million. And this is based largely on conversations with developers who gut checked it for us. But we're going to get into a little bit later how developers might think about land valuation in a moment. So now that we know what our project looks like and what the development conditions are, we can come up with a cost estimate. So we've broken down costs into 3 categories that I'm going to walk through. The first category is land. So as I mentioned, land costs roughly $8 million, and that includes closing costs and due diligence. The second category is hard costs. Hard costs make up roughly 2/3 of our overall project costs. And these are costs that are associated with the actual construction. So it includes materials like concrete, timber, HVAC systems, and it also includes construction labor wages. It also includes around a 5% contingency. One thing, again, that I think will be important when we get into the next panel is that Terner Terrace, we assume, does not pay prevailing wages. because the project does not receive any public subsidies. Previous Terner Center research from 2020 estimated that prevailing wage costs are roughly $30 additional per square foot. And I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss about that in the next panel. Okay. And lastly, we're going to talk about soft costs, which are roughly 25% of the total. Fees here are variable, but we estimated roughly $41 million in total fees. And then this section also includes financing. So that's the cost to close your loan, soft cost contingencies, operating reserves, and it also includes the developer fee, which goes to pay the developer's overhead, which includes out-of-pocket expenses that the developer incurs to manage the project. So in this case, developer fee is roughly 3% of total cost. It also includes consultants, architects, engineers, legal, accounting, etc. So one of the things I think it's really important to know, and a big difference between the 2019 report and the current report, is that costs have escalated pretty significantly in recent years. And you can see here, figure 1 is hard costs and figure 2 is soft costs. So for hard costs, one of the reasons why we've seen this escalation is because inflation has disproportionately impacted the residential construction sector. In 2021, construction costs increased 11.5% over the previous year. In 2022, the cost rose by an additional 14.1%. So I'm sure we can have a conversation about why this might be. We believe it's from a mix of factors, including disruptions to the supply chain, which leads to higher costs for goods, extended wait times for critical materials like lumber and roofing, et cetera. And then soft costs also have increased in part because some of them are calculated as a percentage of the hard cost. But in other instances, just because the cost of doing business, even for the consultants, has increased. Okay, now that we know our costs, we have to figure out how we're going to pay for our project. So we need to go out for financing. As I spoke earlier, do we use our own money? No, we use other people's money. Okay, so part of other people's money is debt in the form of a loan from a bank, and part is equity, which is a private investor who covers what the bank will not. Each of these partners has specific return metrics which need to be met in order for them to want to invest in our project. So let's go ahead and we're going to start with our bank. Much like buying a house, the bank will give us most of the funding, but not all of it. We've basically determined that we can likely obtain 55% of our project costs from a bank loan. This is lower than what we've seen historically. In our 2019 report, we thought it would be more like 65% loan to cost. And before that, you could maybe get even 70% of costs covered with loans. But today, because projects are so expensive and so risky, the bank will only give us a little more than half of what we need. And this is important because this debt from a bank is actually less expensive than debt from equity. So the more we can get covered by the bank, the better for our project. But so we're even in a worse position than we were in 2019. So we need to go ahead and find $36 million worth of equity. So as we think about equity and we think about investors, it's important to think about who are they. It's important to remember that these entities do not have to invest in housing. They can invest in anything. And they are part of what we refer to as the global pool of capital, which means basically they're looking for the best return for any investment. Private equity is typically what comes to mind when we think about investors. These private equity firms typically invest in all manners of real estate, and they can do it in any part of the country. So if it becomes too risky to invest in California, they can go to Texas or anywhere else that they perceive a lower risk and higher return. There are also pension funds like CalPERS or other unions who use real estate investments to round out their members' pension growth. And lastly, there are insurance groups. So it's important to remember that all these groups need to ensure that their investments can be used to provide a return. So now we're going to talk about our return metrics. We're going to focus on something called return on cost. Return on cost basically compares the cost to build and manage a new building like Turner Terrace against the revenue that it will generate. And for those math nerds out there, the calculation is the first year of net operating income divided by total development costs. And then we go ahead and we compare that to something called a capitalization rate or a cap rate, which measures the return one can expect by purchasing an existing building nearby. And then we have to compare these two metrics to find out whether or not it's worth it to develop the new building compared to just buying a nearby building. If it's not, there's no motivation to build. So in essence, we have to have a return on cost that is higher than our cap rate. That will become important next. So when we're looking to compare these two, what are we looking for? We need to demonstrate a return on cost that's roughly 1 percentage point higher than cap rates. And please commit this to memory because I'm going to be quizzing you later. This is called the spread. In 2019, the spread was smaller because developers could expect to still attract capital with just a half a percentage point of a spread. Because costs and risks are so much higher today, investors are looking at something closer to a full percentage point more. So in our market, we know that cap rates are about 5%, which means that Turner Terrace needs to have a return of cost of roughly 6% to attract investment. Based on the cost to build and the rents we expect to charge, we can come with our return on cost. Okay, everybody, how do we do? Wah, 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 wah. So we can see that not only is our return on cost not higher than our cap rate, is actually below our cap rate. So this is what we call bad. Okay. It is very bad. And I wish our story were happier, but it is sad. Our beloved Turner Terrace is not going to get built in today's market. Okay, so what are we going to do now? Oh my God, our project is not going to pencil. So to examine how rents impact feasibility, we looked at the difference between 3 sets of rents for our 1 bedroom. First, we looked at setting the rents at more affordable levels. So we looked at setting the rents at $2,250 a month, which is affordable to a 1-person household making area median income. So basically, roughly 100% of AMI in the East Bay. So we do worse. I think that is self-evident. Then we looked at what is actually in a market study that says that our brand new development could command. But even at that price, we still are not going to make our project pencil. So like, okay, well, let's just make the rents higher. So then we're like, let's try $4,000 a month. And at that point, Turner Terrace works. But there are 2 big problems. One, nobody would actually pay that amount, or a few people would. And second, those are really high rents. So that's not a good solution. And this is where our friends, the policymakers, can come in. We need to think about different policy choices and how they impact feasibility. We looked at 4 different policy levers. One is reducing fees, another is reducing parking, another is increasing density, and the last is reducing hard costs. Let's find out how they impact feasibility. So first, if we reduce fees from $40,000 a unit to $10,000 a unit, we increase our return on cost a little bit. Then if we reduce our parking from 1-to-1 to 0.25 to 1, we get another little bump. If we increase density, we get another bump. And if we reduce our hard costs by 10%, then we are successful at the rents that the market studies say are appropriate in the market. We recently came up with a new product, a new paper, looking at using the same tool and focusing specifically on middle income households. And I just wanted to share that briefly with you as well, because I thought it was very interesting. So unsurprisingly, as we learned earlier, middle income housing performed even worse than market rate housing when looking at the same financial indicators we looked at for the development math tool. But when we shifted some policy levers, middle income housing became more feasible in some markets. And you can see we're comparing the East Bay, the South Bay, and Los Angeles. And what you can see here is the dark line is the baseline. The light blue is reducing parking the same amount to 0.25 to 1. Fee reductions and density bonus, but really ended up getting these projects, some of them to feasibility, was a property tax exemption. And as I think we know, the welfare property tax exemption can really only be used by nonprofits for housing at 80% of the median, not at 100. And then we did a mixed income project where we had market rate units and then 33% of the units as affordable to households making 100% of AMI. And you can see basically the same thing. The cumulative impacts of the policy changes coupled with a property tax exemption got us to feasibility. Lastly, I just wanted to share that we are going to be coming out with one more product in this line, which looks at missing middle housing. So I know there's a lot of middles that we're talking about. So middle income between 80 and 120% of median income, and then missing middle are basically small apartment buildings. And that should be coming out in June, and we're really, really excited about it. And with that, I think our tutorial has ended, and we're happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Corey, should I start? Are you
I'm tech support.
okay? So hi everybody. I'm Randi Gerson, not only her backup singer, not only the co-chair of the board, but I do real estate development. I've been working for affordable housing developers and market rate developers for my whole career, and my real primary job is trying to get things built. And I started in the graphs that you had where things were way over the line, and now I'm where we're way below the line. So I've seen the markets change. So I was really interested in what you had to say, and I'm really glad that people are getting educated, and that was a great presentation. So I had the privilege of seeing this before you all, and so I came up with a couple of questions. I'm also a little bit of a troublemaker. So, and I just wrote them down. So first I'm interested in your opinion about what makes it hard to build in the Bay Area, we're in California, but easy to build in Idaho, South Dakota, Florida, and all those places that you showed on your earlier slide.
I think that's a great question. Is it on now? Oh, good. Okay, great. So I think a number of different factors. One is that our regulatory environment is really, really different in California than many of the other places that you described. And some of that regulation is really great, and some of it we might want to rethink. And one of the things that I think is particularly important to rethink is the way that we do environmental review. So California has, as you well know, its own environmental law called the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. And CEQA can be very, very, very problematic for many projects without actually providing environmental protection. And so I think if we want environmental protections in the state of California, we should think about doing that and then basically making it much easier to build infill housing. So that's just one example of the type of regulation. I think another thing that is very difficult about the state of California is that we passed, I'm sure you guys already all know this, but I mean, Prop 13, right? So that is a law that capped property taxes and then basically made it very, very difficult for local governments to raise money, the money that they need in order to pay for public benefits and community benefits and like all the things that we would want a government to be able to pay for. We can't just raise property taxes in order to do that. And so I think that puts sort of particular onus on new development as sort of the mechanism to pay for a lot of the things that we need. So those are just two examples.
Thank you. And that's particularly housing, some
Yeah.
of those. So like just to riff off of that, do you think that we're better in California because of CEQA and because of some of these things that we get added to the projects? Or do you think that, we're not any better? I know.
Well, I think we're different. I think we're different. I think CEQA is like a giant problem personally. I think if you look at other states, they don't have a CEQA analog. And I think CEQA presents such a big challenge to infill housing that I mean, honestly, I just rather do away with it entirely and then come up with like an entirely different planning framework that protects lands. Yeah.
I mean, and then I would say that the Prop 13 is really part of the problem too, because you can't fund your schools and you can't fund your parks, and then you're just putting that on top of housing because there's no other way to do it. Would you agree?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw it out to the audience. Is there anybody out here that has any questions? Our tech support right here, this guy. There's a few, I see a few hands.
Thank you for your presentation. Kim Pipkin, Black Developers Forum. So in your development math, I saw a lot of numbers, but I didn't see the valuation of politics. So, because that's kind of a premium, right? I mean, I don't know, right? Is that a premium? Like, what is the cost of the politics? Because I live in leafy Marin County, and that's a whole other premium. Yeah. So, can you talk about that fuzzy math?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So I think we're really using Turner. I mean, Turner Terrace it's pretend. I mean, I think everybody knows that, right? So we're using it as a mechanism to sort of show how the different development math variables interact with one another. It doesn't take into account the challenges that politics produce for projects. So it doesn't take into account, for example, when a city council might drag out a project for 2, 3, 4 years, increase the carrying cost. It doesn't take that into account. Or when, all of a sudden a project might need to do a giant environmental impact report when otherwise it might not. No, it doesn't do that. And all those things do add cost. And I guess I would say, for Turner Terrace, if you added those costs in, it would just make the financials even worse. It would make it just even worse. It would put us even deeper in a hole. And I think that's what we want policymakers to understand. That's the purpose of the tool, is to show them that even in the rosiest possible scenario, projects aren't penciling today. So what happens if you make things worse? Things are worse. That I think that's the point of the tool.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm Lisa Zahner with City Real Estate, and I'm a 504 board member. So I love this presentation, and I'm just wondering, why was San Francisco not included in the calculations? That's my question number one. And number two is, would you ever consider giving this presentation to our Board of Supervisors, who personally, and I think probably others here too, think they might get some value out of it?
Okay, so answer to number one. So I must say I was not with Turner when the case studies were decided, but I can intuit. And then Muhammad, you can shake your head yes or no if I get it right. Okay, so San Francisco is its own special little, I don't know what to call it. It's a special little animal, and if we want to be demonstrating kind of broadly how things work, San Francisco might not be the most effective case study. Is that yes? Mohammed says yes. That is why San Francisco was not chosen. And then in answer to your question about would we give this presentation at the San Francisco Board of Supervisors? Yes, absolutely. We would be absolutely delighted. And, when Supervisor Melgar comes back, if she wants to invite us, we'd be happy to come. And we're happy to present to any public body this work, because that's why we created it. So if you want to make that happen, we'd be happy to do it.
Mr. Roach. Just my board members tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. This is awesome. Great to see you. We back here were wondering how policymakers magically reduced hard costs by 10%.
Oh, I knew somebody was going to ask that question.
She planted me here for that.
So again, Mohammed, I'm glad you're here because maybe you can shine some light on this. But I think the idea is like that is tricky to do for policymakers to actually magically do that. But there might be some things that they could do, for example, to look at sort of requirements, say, around the buildings that they could potentially shave off some requirements. They could maybe look at building code requirements and review them with an eye towards having them be a little bit more feasible. They could, what else could they do, Randy? What else do you think?
To shave 10% off?
Yeah.
Never seen that happen.
Yeah.
You can make units smaller, and then you get a higher unit cost. You could change the exterior of the building a little bit. You could look at the finishes of the product. But then you're impacting your rent. So you just have to, it's a balancing act. And it's not, you're already building a non-realistic project. So, taking 10% off is going to be very tricky.
Yeah. Muhammad, do you want to add to that?
No. You can meet me after and I could talk about this. I don't want to steal the thunder. I just have a question, actually.
Oh, okay.
Uh-oh.
Ruh-roh.
Or maybe I'm teeing up a question. Muhammad El Meldeen, I'm Policy Associate at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. I was told to introduce myself. So the loan to cost ratio has reduced from 2019 to now. What could policymakers do so then banks feel like they could have more trust into investing into housing?
That's an awesome question. Do you want me to start? And then, okay. Okay, that sounds great. So I think part of it just has to do with the reduction of risk. So what can we do to actually de-risk the system at every single point? So can we make more entitlements by right? I mean, that's certainly the direction that the state has been thinking about. Can we just make it very, very clear, what the timelines are for certain types of development, actually enforce those timelines so that we can trust that those actually go forward? There might be creative financial tools actually that could be used to try to reduce some of the risk. Randy,
I'm just what you said, a discretion. If we could take out the discretion and if people know how long, if the building department would move at a certain speed that we could count on, and that the planning department and the neighborhood and the council and the planning commission was not all, they didn't have to go back and forth so many times. They knew exactly what it is that we could build, then it would be faster, and then we could shave. That would mean a lot more than 10% of the construction costs. And that would make the banks feel safer, and the equity investors too. It would really help everything come down.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin Zucker from Reuben Junius Rose. Really appreciate the presentation that you all have put forward. One thing that I observed was the math seems to make more sense in LA, at least when you're toggling over, it ticked up significantly more for there. And I'm wondering if there's anything to glean that we here in the Bay Area could sort of tips and tricks or best practices or things that we could learn from them so that we can get our numbers to jump up like theirs.
Yeah, that is a great point. Actually, and Muhammad, I'm just going to call on you again when you're done chatting. Why do you think, which you should not be doing during this lecture, by the way. Do you have any thoughts about why the LA one works better?
I would say the labor force might be a little bit cheaper because living costs are a little bit lower than they are in the Bay Area. I would say like there are some things that LA is doing, like ED1. I've been seeing that a lot of banks are funding that at a higher loan to cost ratio. I believe it's just a little bit more concentrated. I know San Diego. I think San Diego is always like the best example when it comes to this. They reorganized their planning department, so you know if you're a developer, you just work with one person, and they work with all the departments instead of you going to each department. So there are many things that we could. I think local governments should take an opportunity when they get their head above the water because they're just drowning right now with all the work of looking at what are the most innovative practices that other localities are doing and adopt it, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. And maybe that's why LA is doing much better than Oakland or San Diego is doing much better than San Francisco. Those were my thoughts. I was talking to Scott a little
I'd like
bit
to
about
just add, as long as that one person's directive is to find a way to say yes.
it.
Because
Mhm.
I have been stuck, and as for everybody in this room, it's been stuck by a person that doesn't want to make it work or has had too many things on their plate. The directive has to be find a way to say yes, of course, within all the rules and regs.
Can I just say one thing about San Diego? San Diego is really remarkable what they've been doing and kind of how they use their planning tools and their planning code to help incentivize infill housing. So, for example, they've done a lot of work to basically clear from environmental review giant swaths of their infill zones, their infill areas, ones that have sort of low, what are called vehicle mild travel locations. And then they constantly iterate to try to improve their planning systems. Like every single year, they actually go through and they look at their planning codes and their building codes, try to see how they can make things better and easier for infill housing to move forward.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Two quick, one point and then one, maybe a question. So raising the elephant in the room about labor. On the sort of bringing down hard costs, I mean, we have seen one positive policy direction, which is the reduction of parking requirements, which, you know, when you're talking about in structure podium-based parking, that makes a substantial difference by my math, at least. Possibly as much as 8-10%. If I'd be curious about others in the room saying, if you take it down to zero, you can get a substantial hard cost saving. On the labor elephant in the room, I'm with Scott Littlehale, Northern California Carpenters Union, to introduce myself. Been looking at this for 20 years, and the year-over-year labor costs are going up between 3 and 5%, right? So explaining 10% jumps in costs, the math there doesn't work unless we're throwing a ton more labor at the problem, which itself could be a problem, right? If we're not recruiting, training, sustaining, retaining skilled productive labor, then that's an industry-wide problem. I guess the question is, if we want to have more of something, you can't really pay less for it, right? If you want to have more labor working on housing, you're not going to be able to bring down costs, certainly, especially if there are options for people to go to work in other industries or in other segments of the industry that pay more. So going to be teeing that up for a reactions conversation, right? Because it goes to this hard cost question. So, which is why we're part of an agenda, I think, to try to resolve how to bring down non-socially productive costs. Anyway, so so if Sarah or our moderator would have any questions or reactions to that, I'd appreciate
Scott,
it.
thank you for that, both the comment and the question, and I appreciate the framing of non-socially productive causes. That was very, very good framing. I guess I would say, of course you're right. Like we want to be attracting more workers to the labor force. We want it to be attractive. We want to have good wages. We want to have all these things, and we want to have housing. And it's a total quandary. I mean, it's just like an absolute quandary, and difficult to figure out how to find our way kind of out of it. One thing I want to offer, which is super interesting and maybe not politically practical, but that's fine because we're here amongst friends, is I had a chance to go to Vienna a couple weeks ago to study social housing. It was super interesting. one of the things that they have is they have a chamber of commerce that is it's chartered by law, and then they have a chamber of labor, also chartered by law. And their chamber of labor is really strong. They are required by law to comment on every single piece of legislation, and they just do a lot of data collection. And we didn't get to the bottom of like their costs are much lower than ours. I think just across the board, I think all of their costs are lower than ours. But when we were talking about labor, one of the things that they were saying is, well, first of all, it's just not analogous because they have in Vienna and in Austria, they have universal healthcare, for example. So everybody just there's no but who pays for the healthcare. It's like everyone pays for the healthcare, and the benefits, everyone pays for the benefits, of course. And so when we start, because of our cuckoo system here, like we load everything into the cost of goods that we already need. And if you start amortizing those over many, many, many people, and they're just kind of part of what the government provides, then it's not loaded into the cost of labor. So you heard it here first that universal health care will help bring down the hard cost of housing. um, but I think there's a lot to learn from their system.
Thank
So-
you.
A little bit of follow-up on that. This came from the Zoom room. How does the pro forma that you talked about compare to affordable housing and then something like a social housing model in Vienna? Like, how do those costs for the builder practically change cerebus paribus?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Randy, I'd love for you to jump in. So I think they change in a couple ways. So one, in an affordable housing project, they will likely use, they almost never will use public subsidy, and so they will be paying prevailing wage and union wage costs. So that's one. The type of financing is completely different. And in fact, my experience with pro formas I used to be an affordable housing developer, and we didn't have to learn about return on cost or cap rates. What we had to do was we created something called, we called it a Takakinator, which was like literally what it allowed us to do was figure out whether or not we're going to qualify for low-income housing tax credits. And so everything was bound kind of chasing these various subsidies. And it wasn't just debt and equity. It was, we had like a bank loan, and then we had low income housing tax credits, and then we might have like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 sources, all layered one on top of the other, all adding to time, all adding to cost. And this is before the glory days of SB 35 and SB 423, where affordable housing got streamlined. This was like a beauty contest. So every affordable housing project, had to be better, more beautiful, more wondrous than anything that a market rate developer would build, because there was so much scrutiny, and you had to be perfect in order to get your entitlements. You just did. And all of those costs, they really, really add up. Now, in social housing, interestingly, when we went and visited it, it was really interesting because their pro formas were not like ours. For social housing, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it basically describes a system. It's like a more robust affordable housing system. So in Vienna, for example, in most U.S. cities, the amount of affordable housing is between 5 and 9% of the total number of units. In Vienna, it's 43%. 60% of residents live in social housing in Vienna. It's a much larger part of our system, and their public framework and their public systems are way, way, way more robust. So they're like, oh yeah, we have like a 0.5% tax on all the workers and a 0.5% tax on all the companies, and that pays, I think it's something like 500 million euros a year for social housing. So it's like incredibly robust. And then they have like 4 sources of funding, and it's de-risked from soup to nuts. It's de-risked. So I think there's you can tell I got really excited. And Corey was there. Corey remembers. Yeah. So it was
Won-
pretty interesting.
Wonderful things happen when you have a ton of cash and low interest rates. It's
Yes.
like a remarkable environment. People can build things.
I was just going to add about the affordable real quickly. I'm not here to, I won't get too deep into it, but what I want to say is that there's, you have different kinds of affordable. You have family housing, and then you have permanent supportive housing, and you might have homeless unhoused housing. So it's every product is going to cost you a different amount of money. I worked on a project that was 29 units of a renovated project that was in pretty good shape that had 15 funding sources. 15, right? And so each of those 15 funding sources had different requirements. So now you're not just like getting like the exactions from one city, you're getting exactions from 15 different funding sources that need something that layer something on. So that's one of the things that make affordable housing expensive. It's never going to be cheaper. And you're going to, and like you said, you're going to get it funded because you're going to have public funds in the project.
A couple other questions came in from the chat. What was your your cost per square foot on Turner Terrace in your target ROI?
They're going to have to follow up with me.
Okay.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
We go Jason, go back to Jeremy, and I think that's
Hi, everybody. Jason Overman, Progress Public Affairs. Hope you guys are doing well. And thank you all for I feel like I'm in grad school in the best way possible. That was super interesting to hear. One thing that I feel like didn't get touched upon in the spreadsheet, or in the slide deck rather, that I've been personally curious about is any analysis you all have on where we're at right now with the market in terms of interest rates, where we've been, where we are now, and where we'll head, and what implications you think that'll have on both what folks will want to try to seek entitlements for, what is maybe in the pipeline or already entitled but being held right now, and could come to a start later on as a result. I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward that if interest rates go down, stuff will get built again more, but the analysis is much deeper, I assume, in terms of folks who really understand the debt and equity markets and what those interest rates are and aren't doing to development. So I'm just curious, any overarching thoughts you all might have on that.
Yeah. So I have to go back and check exactly what the interest rate assumptions were in the pro forma. I just have to go back and check, but obviously they were higher, right? So interest rates have just been creeping up, and not even creeping. They've been going up. One thing that's really interesting to think about is when you think about inflation overall, housing is like actually a huge part of inflation. So they calculate inflation using a basket of goods, and housing is one of the largest. And so there's actually kind of like an iterative relationship between housing costs and inflation that kind of keeps it going up. So actually, if we want to curb inflation, we have to think about housing costs too. And Randy, do you want to talk a little bit about where you're
I
seeing
just think
interest rates?
it's just one piece of the puzzle. Like interest rates aren't going to be the magic bullet that changes everything. It's everything else that we were talking about earlier. But it certainly will help.
Hello, Jeremy Bamberger, architect at SCB, board member of the HAC. I have a request of the calculator. Yeah, other people's money. No, I'm interested if we could measure the opportunity costs and the negative externalities of not building said housing in a given place. The two that I think of specifically, and I look to Ed Glazer for this, who I love his analogy of butterfly effect, that he blames San Francisco for Houston. Essentially, every unit of housing that we don't build in a temperate Mediterranean climate, thank you to CEQA, is a carbon cost and a net negative environmental impact. So like, what is the environmental cost of not building Turner Terrace in Oakland with temperate climate and low, air conditioning and heating requirements? And then the other one is urban economists have demonstrated that density disproportionately increases GDP under the premise that a lot of smart heads next to each other create really, really amazing things. So what is the GDP kind? They've measured this stuff into like the trillions. I mean, this is a crazy number. So like on a per unit basis, what is the GDP cost of not building this housing next to other density? And the hope is like, if we could start measuring those in tandem with this, you could, I don't know what the mechanism would be, but you could start actually measuring what you're losing, and that might influence our illustrious board of supervisors.
Well, it's super interesting. It's sort of, I will say it's beyond our dear little Turner Terrace to do those kinds of like incredibly complex models that you're describing, but it is something that actually, we're developing different types of models and different ways of thinking about things that might be able to speak to some of those comments. I would say just one thing on that, and kind of it gets us back to CEQA. CEQA analyzes the impact of projects against a no project alternative. So like under CEQA, what would be great is if there were no humans anywhere, right? None. So like, yeah. So like, what if we change CEQA? First of all, what if we got rid of it? Number one. But so number two, if you're going to change it, what if we actually analyzed it against the kind of good planning alternative? That would be pretty cool.
I think Corey is telling us we're done. I just wanted to say thank you, Sarah, for everything. I've learned a lot from being with you. It's an honor to share the stage with you. You're great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to take about a 5-minute break. Let the folks here stretch your legs, go grab something to drink, and we will be back with our second panel here in a moment. Beautiful. That was great. That was like exactly.
Yeah. So how are our friends from the layout?
Mic check, 1, 2. Okay, there we go. Talk a little closer to the mic here. So, over the past half dozen years, the legislature, along with the governor's administration, has tried to remove some of the barriers to address the housing supply and get more housing built. And, we've seen dozens of housing bills passed. We've seen the state set higher targets for cities to plan for more housing, try to take a more active role in trying to force cities to be accountable to those state laws. And yet permitting went down, as Sarah pointed out last year. And so my first question to each of you is let's just start with the pain points. Why did we see permitting go down? Where do you still see some of the sticking points? And I'll just go down the line. So Jay, I can start with you. Why are we seeing permitting go down?
Well, a lot of it, I think, and was talked about, is where's the money coming from? Not trying to be just total snark about this, but when you look at, I've ran into developers who claim they can't make a dime at anything above 2%, can't get investment on that. But I put a lot of it in the investment overall, setting aside the public investment for affordable housing, things like that, which I can talk about in a minute as well. But that's a problem, the revenue stream. Also, still you have broken entitlement systems at the local level. One real example, if I may, real fast, Los Angeles was brought up. We had AB 2011 project Streamline. Normal course of that project, there was a new cutout, had a tree, it was going to be moved per the code of the city. The city tried to make a move that was a separate project and full secret review required on that. So that kind of stuff leads to an overreaction of like ED1 that strips everything, so that's still a problem. San Francisco is kind of laughed about, unique and different. Continues to be that sometimes I would say even staff activism with the city to slow down the process. None of that helps at all. That's a big part of the problem still.
Supervisor Belgar, yeah, to you.
Yeah, I would add to everything that Jay just said that demand in many areas in San Francisco for housing has gone down. Folks left the city during pandemic, rents went down. And so in terms of return for the investment and people being willing to risk so much money to put into construction, there's been a softening.
I'd say can folks hear me? There we go. To play sort of devil's advocate a little bit, I totally agree with both of you, which is that cost of capital is an issue, sort of the macro interest rate environment, no doubt. The city did lose a significant amount, but a decent amount of its population during the pandemic as well, because of a distributed workforce. Sort of tech going fully remote was not healthy for the city in many ways. Housing was one of them. But it's not a 2020 onwards issue. We've actually had really low production for years, even when we had zero interest rates and when we had a booming economy locally. And that goes back to the fundamental issue, which is that we do not have a system set up to actually build housing in San Francisco, no matter the intent. And so everyone wants to, the desire is there. Now, the shades of kind of the political will as to what that looks like, but fundamentally, the fact that let's just say everyone wants to build affordable housing and agrees on that topic, the fact that it costs $1 to $1.2 million a unit is indicative of how broken our process is, even if interest rates were at zero. So that's fundamentally some of the issues. Jay touched on it originally, and you can keep layering on state programs to help, but if we don't address the issues locally, and San Francisco is being a prime example, but a lot of cities have these same problems. If we can't get through permitting, if we can't get out of our way on inspections and not having folks be ideological in the way they carry out their work at the bureaucratic level, the administrative level, then we can't build. But the state also doesn't help us either. And I can give you examples of it, but.
Yeah, so, that kind of leads me to, I guess, this next question, which is, you have right now the ear of a supervisor, of a union leader. What do you most want them to hear about how they can help you address some of your pain points? And this is going to go around, we're going to go backwards now. So I'll start with you, Cyrus.
Well, I'm blessed to be able to call Supervisor Melgar and Jay close friends, so they've already heard all of this. But and I don't think that their intent or desires are different than ours, actually, fundamentally. So that's like the one key thing here. I think when you look at San Francisco itself, there's sort of four broad categories of issues, and then you have it compounding with the state issues, right? So we have issues when it comes to the planning entitlement phase. I'll just give you an example in each category. So we came up with our own local density program. We thought it was a great program. Supervisor Melgar was then Planning Commission president. And said Home SF program, which was our response to the state density program, actually created more vulnerability for a project application to be appealed. It added one more step of appeal or vulnerability to a project than if we'd just gone the traditional route, and it certainly didn't expedite any time. So it didn't reduce any of the time frame. So just unintended consequence of a good intention. One example. We get into the construction, we get into, excuse me, the permitting phase. It took us over a year and a half with Supervisor Safai, with the carpenters, with every one of the trades pushing hard to make sure that each of the agencies actually got through their reviews. Bureau of Urban Forestry, perfect example. Street tree removal. Well, we had another hearing that got appealed because fundamentally people didn't want to see this project get built. That further delayed the project. And we already had a whole host of approvals that should have included that one item, right? But this is a bureaucratic issue. Someone needs to deal with it. Now you get to the course of construction. I love my brothers and sisters in labor. Someone decided that wage theft was an issue. Mind you, we're wall-to-wall union on the project. The ordinance gets passed, but no one tells DBI that the ordinance doesn't apply to wall-to-wall union projects. And we try to get levied a bond that would have cost us $100,000 a year for a project that without a PLA was already union pension fund financed, built wall-to-wall union with inclusionary housing. Should never even applied. Bureaucratic breakdown, not an intent issue. Again, right? Now we get into the lease up, and Dahlia, the Mayor's Office of Housing, 25% affordable, 48 units of affordable, more than any other single 100% affordable project built in that district in the 20 years preceding. And they can't figure out how to fill these units because their system's broken. So these are just San Francisco examples. I just gave you one. I have hundreds in each category, but that's why we can't build housing here. Intent is there. We can't follow through.
Supervisor Melgar?
Well, you know,
And remember, I said she was Planning Commission President, Melgar, at the time, so.
and now Chair of Land Use and Transportation with, you know, a main job of trying to herd the cats. So I will say something back to you in terms of, you know, like what we want to hear. And I also have to say, disclaim that I love both these gentlemen and respect them tremendously. So, you know, there is a pretty wide gap between policy and policies and procedures and implementation. And I think in San Francisco, because we're a large and very bureaucratic city, that gap is wide. And, you know, sometimes we think, oh, they can just pass a law or change the law. That does not automatically make it more efficient. So I could give you lots of examples, and you probably, you know, so like Dahlia is a perfect example. Dahlia is the system by which the Mayor's Office of Housing assigns affordable housing. Folks apply to it. They go through a lottery. They have to put in, you know, their qualifications, income, all that stuff. That system does not talk to Section 8. It does not talk to the coordinated entry system from homelessness. It doesn't talk to the people working on domestic violence issues who may have a woman who needs a place to sleep like tonight. So, you know, we can say, oh, you know, we pass inclusionary for people at, you know, 80% of AMI, but when it comes to implementation and doing those, writing out the manuals, putting together the process for application, we are so bureaucratic and inefficient. And that, I will say, is not the function of the, the board of supervisors and someone else. But, you know, it is a complicated thing that other people have been able to solve. And so another example is the fact that you go for entitlements. You know, it's a long process, you know, before all of the state legislation passed, people could appeal it, all that stuff. And then you go to the building inspection department and you have to go through another different process, a different database, and then they go to fire, and that's a whole other process, and they go to DPW for the sewer ladder, and that's complete. So that, you know, that is not legislation. There's nothing that says it has to be done this way. It just is the way it is. And so I think that one of the things that we need to tackle is that inefficiency, and it's just bureaucracy. It's not, you know, policy per se.
Supervisor Melgar, and I'm going to get to you, Jay, next. But I did want to push back on that a little bit, because is there a role, I mean, or how do you see the role of supervisors to see that bureaucracy, understand that there's an inefficient system, and demand accountability from that bureaucracy?
So the Board of Supervisors can, as you know, change the charter. There, we do have, you know, the right, if there's 4 of us, to put something in front of the voters, or, you know, gather signatures. It's all difficult and, you know, expensive. So a lot of it is under the sort of executive branch, but it is also difficult to do, right? Because we have these very large departments and a whole industry that is, you know, dedicated to doing things a certain way. And I will also say that there's a reason why this is, it didn't just happen, you know, accidentally in San Francisco. I will go out on a limb and, you know, because I know this is being recorded and I'm running for reelection. So I will tell you that it is the system to make development difficult in San Francisco was done on purpose. So, you know, I represent the west side of San Francisco. It's mostly single family homes. In my neighborhood, my CCNRs, I live in Ingleside Terraces. It says in the CCNRs that we should not be selling our homes to people who are Black or of Chinese descent, or, you know, a bunch of others. It's still there. When the Supreme Court struck that down, you know, there's it opened up the possibility of homeownership for lots of folks on the west side. I don't think it's a coincidence that that's when we started seeing all of these efforts to protect the, you know, single family character of the west side. But what was unique to San Francisco is that this happened at the same time as on the east side of town. There was a redevelopment of the Fillmore, the planned redevelopment of the Mission. There was the encroachment of the financial district onto Chinatown, and a bunch of political fights that ensued, like the I Hotel. And so there was an alliance that was made from, you know, by folks on the west side with folks on the east side of town that were trying to protect the cultural character of their neighborhoods from displacement and gentrification. That is unique to San Francisco, that there was that alliance. And that alliance, which led to, you know, Prop M during Dianne Feinstein's era, and a bunch of stuff afterward, that alliance has held until fairly recently, when, you know, carpenters and YIMBYs and all sorts of folks in this generation started pushing back, and folks that made up that alliance started getting older and are not as active. And so I do think that there is a change politically that's coming, and we are kind of dismantling a lot of those systems that were purposely put to make it difficult for everyone. Because, you know, if you make it difficult for everyone, then you protect, you know, the way things are, neighborhood character, historic, whatever. And also you make it, you give communities that don't want to see development more control. And so I think that that was purposely done. It's difficult to dismantle bureaucratic systems, but that is, I think, what we have to do.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll give you your chance, Jay, to
Good. Well, I want to echo my comrades up here, and I love them too, no doubt about it. So I'm going to echo some of that, but what Cyrus was talking about earlier, I mean, this has been something that the carpenters in different capacities have been very concerned about, is the lack of production in San Francisco and other urban areas within our jurisdiction. and the broken system. Hey, I'll put it out there. I know it's being recorded. The city of San Francisco itself, I appreciate every point Supervisor Melgar made. Consolidation needs to happen. I refer to it as cheap emotional politics, where you take issues, and again, it's this idea of that we're not anti-housing, and it's really to exclude folks. I criticize others in the quote labor movement as well about this sometimes, that don't lead from fear, don't play cheap emotional politics. What's the issue? It's no secret. You know, the working class of San Francisco has been expelled. That's happened for decades. There's no workforce housing being built here. There's attempts and minuscule, and sometimes you get an incorporation of it. But we even try to run local legislation that would have brought teacher housing, and the approach of quote teacher leaders was that we didn't write it, we'll fight it. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's baked into a provincial political system with a working class lens, if I may be bold to say it that way. It's created a huge issue economically. It's led to a huge strain on our transportation system, strain on our environment overall. You know, CEQA is a whole nother thing, it'll probably come up in a minute. But when you force the working class to travel 2 and 3 hours to the job centers, it destroys the transportation. Now we see kind of activism around transportation projects, hyper political, right, to try to stop any kind of expansion. So where are workers supposed to go? The social cost of all that is really, not to be dramatic, crushing working folks in our state, in that you now see in the construction industry the highest level of addiction in construction workers in our state of any industry, second highest suicide ideation. Childcare affordability is part of that. If you have possibly two partners, two breadwinners in the home, you can't afford childcare, one's going to stay home. So again, this is unsustainable. At the root of all of that, we would argue, is housing in the broken system on a couple levels. Resource-wise, well, I'll pause there. I'll go on and on. But in SF, right, really bold, and I appreciate what Myrna said, that to take bold moves to take on a system that is baked in. The status quo hasn't kept us in 1970, right? The status quo has pushed us back further and further as the world moves forward, both in a negative and sometimes positive way. We are going backwards in the city. I'm a big fan of saying, hey, where SF goes, California goes, and the country goes. That's now kind of flipped, right? As we see more, LA came up a bit earlier. And again, I'm well familiar with the challenges down there. It is not an affordable place anymore. That's according to my brothers and sisters down in LA. So again, the challenges here are being incorporated in some ways in other areas. We see it in Mountain View, we see it in Dono Beach, we see it all over the place. This kind of machinations to stop housing. I believe it's exclusionary. I believe it's an attack on the working class overall, and it amplifies. It's like sloganeering. Let's help the underserved community. How do you want to help the underserved community? How do you pull folks up if you're not intentional about it and it's not trackable and accountable? You can't, folks can't rise up, right, and create even more of a tax base that helps everything if there's no jobs and no housing. Layer on that, I'm going to try to get a new career, even in construction, and I have to have a vehicle, right? How do I get that? And how do I travel to all these jobs? I certainly can't take mass transit. I'll never make it as an apprentice carpenter. It's impossible. I went all over the map. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. So now I think, you've each talked a little bit about like what you want the other people to hear. And, this whole conversation is about getting to yes. And so I think that there's also some trade-offs involved in that, right? And so now I kind of want to talk about what you all might be willing to give up or compromise on or trade off on in order to get to yes. And, Jay had brought up return on investment. Sarah brought up this idea of return on investment. Cyrus, we think a lot about, making developments pencil, and some of that is profit. And so, at what level of profit would you, or how much might you be willing to reduce that? What level of profit do you need to make that project feasible? And at what point would you reduce that profit in order to see a project go forward? Or what would enable you to reduce that level of profit?
So I think a couple things. One is that the notion of sort of profitability is relative, right? So it depends on what your source of capital is. It depends on where the project is. It depends on how risky that jurisdiction is that you're doing your, the building in, the project in. And so I think and then one of the other issues is that there's fundamentally a misunderstanding of sort of the role of developer, which is sort of akin to, we're not in LA. I use the movie producer analogy often, but like a developer is not the one that ultimately makes that decision. It's the equity and the debt. It's the lenders and it's the investors that make that decision. And most of the time, most institutional equity and most institutional debt is actually coming from union pension funds, public pension funds, life cos, et cetera. So it's a much more symbiotic relationship than I think people equate to this. Even your question, right? And I know you didn't intend it that way, but even the question suggests that I get to make that decision, which I wish I could. I fundamentally can't, which is also why you're not seeing people invest in San Francisco today to take that outsized risk associated with development here, whether it's housing or not, because it's too much of it's a red line that people aren't willing to cross. No one's willing to go to investment committee to take the risk because of how volatile the legislative process is here, how volatile our policies are here and policy making. And then fundamentally just the duration risk associated with it. So in San Francisco, I think it's going to take us years and years and years to get to yes, to get any of the pension funds or life companies or others to invest in equity and debt. And remember, they are ultimately still the investors in all these other institutional groups that folks look at, like, oh, the sort of vilifying the, unnamed, billionaire corporation, whatever, right? This money, it really does always come back for the most part to pensions and to life insurance companies and so on, which ultimately affects just about everyone in this room. So I'm not going to give you numbers because I don't have numbers, right? San Francisco is off limits today. But what I do know will fix San Francisco in terms of getting to yes is reducing the perception of us being completely unstable as a city in terms of how we make decisions. So being consistent in our ability to stay on message that we collectively believe in housing. And not only that, we're going to do everything we can to actually make it happen. And then more importantly, to clean up the city and to deal with a lot of the other, and I'm not talking about the clean and safe streets. Yes, that's important. But I'm talking about the perception issue that we have, the corruption at DPW, the corruption at DBI, the corruption at, and so on. It's like, these are problems. They deter investment in the city. Those are all things we control. We're not talking about macro interest rates. We're not talking about, labor rates are what they are. We have contracts. They're one of the most stable things we know that we can project. It's commodity pricing, and it's what our self-imposed sort of system that creates unnecessary risk, time and money.
And what can you control as a developer? How can you be part of the process? Or what levers can you pull yourself in order to make the process a little bit easier? Or where do you think you might be willing to compromise?
Again, I don't know that it's much of a compromise, candidly, because we all agree as to what needs to happen. I think, in fact, most people agree as to what needs to happen. I think part of what's incumbent on us, and I'll say this for every developer, is that for too long, developers have been scared to speak up in this city and have just bit their tongue and agreed to just go with whatever it is that they're dealing with, whether it's dealing with corrupt officials, in these different bureaucracies, or electeds or otherwise, just because they want access and they think that's the only way they can cut through the issues that exist for them to get ahead personally. I think we need to band together and collectively as an industry say enough is enough. And I'm not talking about just developers here now. I'm talking about business, investors, labor, electeds, et cetera, getting together and holding people accountable. And the fact is that elections matter. And so there are people that are colleagues of Supervisor Melgar who fundamentally disagree with everything we just said, and they need to be removed from office. Fundamentally, that's how an election. So, and if we have a system that actually holds people accountable to their actions, then we can finally fix the system. But it starts by speaking up. And I think too long, and I don't know if you all see this or not, but I think at least my colleagues in the industry have been too scared to speak up in San Francisco. And it took us getting robbed at our house for me to start speaking up the way that I have been, because I do believe the quality of life issues are fundamentally at the heart of a lot of these other things, because it's the same electeds that have allowed a lot of that to happen. But we need to start speaking up about where Dahlia doesn't work and where a ton of other things that may have been put in place with the right intention, but have had the bad, consequence. Acknowledge it, have some humility, and say, you know what, we're going to work together to figure this out, whether it's legislatively or otherwise.
Jay, that kind of makes me think about the way that the Carpenters Union took a big break from, made a split with the other unions that had kind of really dominated housing legislation in California for a number of years. And the Carpenters really bucked the trend with AB 2011. And I'm just wondering what made that politically possible for the Carpenters to do that, and how would that be possible for other unions or, other organizations? Because it's kind of a politically risky move.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't mean this in a self-serving manner, but, change in leadership in the Regional Council of Carpenters in the North and in being in alignment with the Carpenters Council that covers Southern California, we had instant alignment, also alignment with our national leadership. Number one priority, build housing. As 30 years as an organizer in my life, been through many housing battles, right? Sometimes not in the same side as the building trades, for example, but also brought some initiatives forward around modular housing, things like this. So myself, as a view towards workers and housing, have always believed in we got to push forward and do it better. So more than, it wasn't so much a split from labor, we were like, here's the right thing to do. Build housing at every economic level, build capacity, and in that process, and to be honest about labor's failure historically for workers working in housing. For 40 years now, those workers have not just been hyper exploited, but no exaggeration, is a crime scene. So we said, here's the deal, and we didn't do it alone. We did it with developer partners, we did it with Enviros, we did it with affordable housing developers, right? But we said, look, we're going to push this forward. Let me just say really quick, if I can, on behalf of the NorCal Carpenters Union, you're welcome. So at the state level, right, this hand-wringing and this and that, and whether folks like it or not, we were not about like attacking anybody and anything else, but here's the deal. We intend to do our best to deliver housing as fast as possible, and for that to pull those 300,000 workers up that right now, and so on resources, I think it's an important point to bring up now. So imagine an accelerator fund, right, that in the first year for workforce housing, for example, just to go there, the missing middle folks talk about, right? I call it the missing housing for the working class, same thing. So this is just what you can track. So the amount of construction workers that are on public assistance, some social welfare program, it's getting up close to half, primarily in the residential industry. $4 billion, right? You start to look at workers' comp fraud, right? You start to look at the underground economy, tax fraud. This is being conservative, getting up close to $2 billion. So what happens with those lost resources? One, on the subsidy, so subsidizing construction workers, right, that are under HUD criteria are either very poor, very low income, or low income. So that's the construction workforce. So right there, $5 billion. Imagine what we could do together to put that into housing production at good wages and conditions, which does what? It starts to put those taxes into the community, which goes into local transportation efforts, schools, right? Other housing. So you can actually leverage that wealth towards wealth. And when I say wealth, I mean production. So this is the stuff that doesn't get talked about a lot. For a labor organization, for us, it's a natural. We say, look, don't set labor standards that are exclusionary, i.e. often PLAs and also provisions that give control to labor, but don't grow labor, right? And other folks have a right to their opinion, but that didn't change. So we didn't see it as politically risky. we saw it as risky to not take a leadership role in that and to build, we had a moment in time to build a grand coalition that after AB 2011 rolled into 423, which brought a majority of construction labor unions in, which would be ourselves, laborers, operators, cement masons. And now that carried into SB4. And now it's a little bit schizophrenic. I start my morning with the California Chamber of Commerce, doing my afternoon here, right? Bay Area Council tomorrow. So again, to be engaged, been a long-term activist with HAC, our organization has, be engaged with everyone, whether we agree on everything or not, to find common solutions. Also, to embrace technology in construction, not through words, but to say, look, we're still building this like if I ordered a car from Ford, right, an Explorer, not to offend anyone, but it's a good example, I think, an Explorer, and they said, we'll deliver it to your house, and 17 workers showed up in overalls and started welding the car in place. That's how multifamily is still built. We can do better than that. And it's not a risk to our membership, it's actually a benefit because more will be produced. So working as a team, including with our leaders, right, to embrace that, you know, and create new types of jobs in construction and hold labor to account that should be financing with their partners, training programs that stay ahead. And also, there's no labor shortage. Labor needs to embrace diversity, inclusion, and track women workers on the job, right? Those have been left out. BIPOC population. I mean, it's no secret. So we can do that and pull people up. The current system pushes exploitation on the production workers. We got to stop that.
Supervisor Melgar, you were talking earlier about, you know, this broken system that we have. And like it or not, homeownership is the biggest investment that most families will ever make. They understandably want to protect that investment. And I'm just wondering, you know, that can often come up against new housing development. I'm wondering, what is the government's role in protecting this investment that homeowners make? And yeah, what like should the government be protecting that investment?
So I don't buy the premise, and I will tell you why. So, you know, I think generational expectations of homeownership change. I mean, the sort of desire to have a suburban house with a big yard and a two-car garage and a big front yard and all that stuff was a previous generation, not so much my daughter's generation. They actually want nothing to do with it. So I think that government's role is actually to address the needs of the present and the future. Not necessarily to, you know, protect the past. And I think that is a lot of what we've been doing in San Francisco to the detriment of our present and our future. And, you know, I can tell you lots of examples of, you know, I'm a homeownership person. Let me just say that before I became a supervisor, I worked for then Mayor Gavin Newsom, and I was the director of homeownership for the city. But I can tell you we are in the bureaucracy remarkably uncreative. And it doesn't match what San Francisco is, because I'll be like the positive to all the things that you said, Cyrus, that I do think that San Francisco is wonderful and magical. And the things that make us so are still here. We have one of the best educated populations of any city in America. We are beautiful. We're still beautiful despite, you know, having some dirty streets. Like, we are poised at the edge of this country, close to Asia, close to Latin America, next to Mexico, which is, you know, our largest trading partner nationally. So we are just gifted, just our location, our beauty, our population. So all of those things are still assets. The other thing that makes up sort of the San Francisco, our character, is that we've been able to reinvent ourselves over and over and over again, dealing with AIDS epidemics, with earthquakes, with fires, with social unrest, with all kinds of things. We have been able to have, because of our population, solutions that are creative and that nobody else has thought of. And I think we're still there. I mean, we're still a place where people who are inventing things that are run by robots are still wanting to come here and tap into our brains and you know, all the things that we have. So I think that we can tap into that also for how we do public policy and run our government. That is the most natural thing to do. For homeownership specifically, we have defined it a certain way. And other cities have been able to do co-op housing with pension fund investment, for example, something we haven't done in San Francisco since the 70s. We have been able to do all kinds of things with down payment assistance loans, with workforce, you know, funds that we haven't done here in San Francisco, but we could. I think we need to be more creative. We need to be bolder. We need to be less bureaucratic, less afraid of the blowback, and just get it done, because I think our present and our future depends on it.
If I can add, sorry, if I can just add 1 second. So I agree with you completely. In fact, you know, one of the biggest reasons to fight for this place is for all those things that you mentioned. But we are actually seemingly coming out of this doom loop and into kind of what we keep calling the boom loop, in spite of many who are in elected office and whose policies have directly targeted and vilified those very forces that are actually at the heart of our innovation, right? So as an example, and this is where politics in San Francisco gets parochial and is detrimental to kind of the overall good, because we do set the tone for the state and I would argue actually for the country when it comes to liberal, sort of the bastion of liberal policy, of liberal belief, right? So, you know, I saw somewhere the other day, you know, our streetcars, our cable cars were this national, international attraction. Those Waymos driving around are the same thing. They're just a 21st century version of the same thing. But we have certain supervisors that are trying to shut that thing down, as you know, each and every day. And it's not to say that it is good or bad. It is simply to say that we have a mindset that is still pervasive. Back to the comments that Supervisor Melgar made about this sort of 70s mindset and what Jay said about this regressive mindset. We still have this notion that there is that we vilify business, that there is an us and them between the people and sort of money, or the people and investors, or the people and their employers. And I think that narrative needs to just be shattered, because candidly, what, if anything, this has proved in the last decade or so, that certainly, or 15 years or so, Jesus, that I've been doing this here in San Francisco, is that in fact, the union workers, labor organizers, the investors, all you folks in this room that service this industry, everyone is united in this same vision of wanting to make this an inclusive and accessible, from an affordability perspective, affordable perspective, you know, city that does not displace people, that does not push people hours and hours and hours outside. But it is incumbent upon us, and I'll say this one thing because I'm on my high horse now, but for how much education we have and how much wealth we have here, and how much of a cradle of innovation that we are, that influences the rest of the world, not just the United States. We have been absolutely appalling in our voter education, our voter engagement, and our voter turnout. I think that for too long we have allowed the system to perpetuate itself without truly being representative of the people's views, because people have just been apathetic. And I see that changing. And I think the last 2-3 years has proven that. And we're continuing to build on it. But we have a long way to go to realign what everyone in this room and who lives here for the most part believes, which are all the shared values that I can guarantee, have amongst the three of us. And I know that a lot of you share. And have that be represented in the leadership that we have in place collectively, so that they can effectively govern. Right now, you can't get a piece of legislation through the board because I mean, can you get to 6 today on
Okay, so give me some
many
credit
issues?
here, because we passed the housing element. We
Yes.
passed the streamlining legislation,
Sure.
and everybody's like, Myrna, you're never going to get that
Sure.
done, but we did do it.
Yep.
So we are halfway.
Yep.
We need to do the density decontrols and the upzoning. It has now become an election issue, but I do think we're going to get it done. So I tell you, I think that,
It'd be a
sometimes.
lot easier if we got you 3 more colleagues on the board that thought the way you did, by the way.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure,
just-
but until then, I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. And I think that, part of it is that sometimes we have this expectation of these jobs that, you can just have opinions and automatically, things come to fruition, but you have to do the hard work of making sure that, HCD is okay with the legislation, that it complies with state, like all this stuff. So I think it is entirely possible to get it done.
Thank you so much for that. I want to check on time and see if we're good for to start taking some audience questions if folks have some. But while folks are thinking about what questions you might want to ask, we talked a lot about Prop 13, and it's just the reality on the ground. It's a very hard policy to change legislatively to get people to vote for that, because no one wants to vote to raise their own property taxes. And I'm sure if it was on the ballot today, any of the homeowners out here would have a hard time voting yes to, rescind Prop 13 if you own a home. So what other alternatives are there for cities besides, putting it on developers? Where else can you go to generate revenue for a city to replace that Prop 13 dollars? And I'm looking at you, Supervisor Melgar. I know it's a big question, but if other folks have ideas, feel free to chime in on that too.
So alternatives to property taxes. I think property taxes is where we should be going. So I understand that it's difficult to convince homeowners to tax themselves. But I, again, will say it is a generational issue. So we passed Prop 19, right? Because, folks in the now second, third generation were benefiting from that low tax basis, and that is not the right thing to do. But I also think that there has been a generational burden placed on younger folks, because they are now carrying the costs of government. And so, it's literally mortgaging our future. So I think that it is something that time will tell. I do think that the days are numbered in the way that we have set this up, because I can't remember who it was who brought up the environmental costs of how we do this. I think Prop 14 does have environmental costs and it has generational costs, and I don't think it's going to survive forever.
I unfortunately don't think government is exactly a bastion of efficiency. And so I think your question itself is flawed, respectfully. It's not about the revenues. It's about how we spend the dollar. Look at how much you can shake your head, but look at how much blatant corruption, 10% of our profit, of our revenues, 1.4 billion going to the homeless related industries and nonprofits and agencies and so on, with zero accountability. Our budget in the last 10 years or so has gone from 7 billion to 14 plus billion, with a population that's remained stagnant. This is not a revenue issue. This is an expenditure issue. Our bureaucracy.
In fairness,
No,
we saw the inflation numbers earlier.
It is not 2x.
So there's some of it is.
It's not 2x in 10 years. I can tell you that for a fact. We are not spending money correctly in this city. We're allowing fraud, waste, and candidly neglect, right? Govern a lot of the agencies without oversight. Contract reform is an absolute necessity before we look at revenues. And moreover, we've got to take Jay's mindset. It is a progressive growth mindset, not a regressive mindset, which says, let's tax more, let's build more and increase our tax base.
So I don't disagree with you about, the corruption and inefficiency. So I'll be the first one to say, but I would disagree that it's not a revenue problem. It is, part of our costs are that, not all of them. So San Francisco's $14.6 billion budget, is only part general fund, and the rest is our businesses. So we actually operate quite a number of businesses that run very efficiently. The airport, the port, the PUC that makes money for the city because we sell electricity, we sell water, so all of those things make up part of that $14.6 billion budget. And the bulk of it is labor costs. So we are in fact understaffed in the city right now. Police, fire, nurses, across the board. We are paying an awful lot of money in overtime. And it is more expensive to run a city that way than it is if you just, paid people for their 8 hours of work and treated them fairly as employees and not work them and have them be away from their family. So that's not so much, corruption. It's just the way that we are right now.
That's
But
inefficiency.
well,
If
yes
we-
and
if
no.
we had
We're
enough-
not the
if we
only
had
ones.
enough- if we had
We
enough
are
law
not
enforcement-
the only
okay,
city.
okay. Enough back and forth. Okay, we're gonna take it to an
Friends.
audience question here.
Show it to the people.
Hi, I'm Brett Gladstone. I've been a land use attorney in San Francisco for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of cycles. First of all, a thank you to the supervisor who was very involved in the down payment assistance program when she worked at the Mayor's Office of Housing and helped on a planning commission approval where my clients assisted that way. But my question is for the Carpenters Union. I've heard many different things about labor support for module and prefabricated housing. And it may be that your union has a different point of view from many others. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
So there's a great story. I won't tell the whole thing or waste time, but if anyone wants to really see, I think it's operative to your question. And thank you, and bless you for being a land use attorney in the city. You're doing good, brother. There's the Buggy Whip Makers Brotherhood. It's quite a story. They were going to stop the automobile. Didn't work out so well. Similar deal. So Carpenters Union, it's pretty straightforward. We believe strongly that as the industry advances, we need to advance with it. And even more than that, we should be at the forefront of it. Dusty Robotics is a robot for laying out in construction that was invented here in San Francisco. Our director of organizing is back there. He's well familiar with it. Before they had one angel investor. We were meeting with the owner and the inventor south of Market, right? And put a deal together to make sure when this took off, carpenters were certified to do it, right? And we didn't know it was going to take off. And then they said, can you introduce us to your general contractors? So a backward-looking organization would have said, oh my God, what about the threat to the carpenter, right? That's pulling a tape and snapping a line. We're like, no, we'll be faster. Carpenters will own that technology on the skill set. We'll train it in our training centers. We will get more. On the specific thing, I call it the page 6 headlines. Big fight, carpenters and building trades, blah, 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 blah. Oh, they're doing our work in a factory. All BS, right? But here's the deal about it. They don't have to like it. Here's the bottom line. No organization. So we've been engaged in the volumetric modular, if you like, industry since the first viable one came online in Northern California, Zeta Homes. And unfortunately, it's a graveyard of failures, and there's a lot of reason, but we were engaged. We learned how to recruit hundreds of workers, right, in a short amount of time, develop training programs, right, and also see it as an amazing organizing opportunity in multifamily residential, right? So we embraced it, learned how to do it, became a partner in it, and as everything has come online, whether Rad Urban and then Factory OS, which is now going through an evolution, which is really great. We've embraced it. What we've seen from that is more hours on job sites of, quote, traditional, right? Because more gets built. And it's not a perfect system. It's not a panacea. We see it as one element. The argument that, and I've had this discussion, years ago with the trades who have an issue with it. It's like, stomp your feet, complain about it. There's zero in your way of investing millions and millions of union dollars into recruitment, training, and organizing factories. We're very proud that we're one of the only unions, except for the recent changes to the United Auto Workers, that is organizing factories in California with the intention of pulling people up. So again, come to the party. What you're not allowed to do is go, oh, that's ours, right? It's a completely different thing. Quality's not less, but it's production. And I don't know, again, I'm using automobiles. I apologize to the environs in the group if I'm offending anyone. Just kidding around. I'm with you on that. We need to evolve that. I'm just kidding around. But if you had a windshield installers union and an engine installers union and a bumper installers union at an auto plant, I think you know what that would look like. So again, but we can get more for all those trades on the jobs with volumetric. And there's nothing to stop them from engaging and organizing when factories come online. We just happen to be fast and good at it. I don't know. I hope I'm not, I'm trying to help your campaign too.
I'll give it a
Proudly.
shot. 1 second.
Vote Myrna.
So Jay, and we've been involved in what Jay was talking about actually, but I will give credit to the trades.
Mhm.
I think they realized that,
Yeah.
and I don't want to speak for them, but there is an effort underway in San Francisco today, led by the trades, to try to do the same thing as what happened with Factory OS in San Francisco. And my view on this, and I'm sure Jay would agree, is that innovation for the factory built approach to reduce the overall cost of production is going to help everybody. And there's so much to go around that this isn't a turf war. This isn't about I've got mine and I want the next one to be mine too, and so on. We're going to do it right in the factory we're involved with, and the trades can do it right in that factory. And candidly, as a developer, we may be customers to all of these factories, depending on which project needs what type of product. Because at the end of the day, we're not all going to drive, Ford Explorers, to use your original analogy. We would like variance. We have choice. There's diversity in that. And so I do think that with the market evolving, and I see the trades now evolving to accommodate where the demand is, or to at least meet where the demand is, so that they're not left behind. Someone needed to trailblaze, and so the Carpenters Northern California did, and for that I'm grateful, because I think that's opened up that, and candidly Tipping Point for taking the risk to build 833 Bryant. If they didn't do that in the city and get the backlash, and that was too long ago, and we haven't built another one since, but we will, that started this conversation. We wouldn't have had this conversation today otherwise.
Time for any more questions? No.
Yeah, well, we're running out, and I'm going to take executive privilege on the last question because we have a special hack one that we ask at the end for everybody. And we talk about we're a coalition, right? And the coalition's got many members, and the Carpenters have proven a path forward that is provided an alternative for the state of California. But I think there's a world in the future where we have the development community, we have elected officials who are supportive of housing, but are also cognizant of the history of development in this country and want to be very real and very honest about that. So as we move forward, we're doing so in a more equitable and inclusive manner. And workers are a part of that. It's all got to be collective, right? And one of the things we had a prep call about this, the three of them really reaffirmed, we're on the same team. And that's really, really critical to understand. And we may disagree because you fight with your team on occasion, but you do so honestly and with integrity. And at the end, you try to emerge with a solution that is yes. And ultimately, that's really what we're driving for. So the final question we have for each of you, and then closing statements generally, and Aaron, I want to bump you into this as well. What makes you hopeful?
Well, I'll jump in. But first off, I want to thank everyone, so I don't forget to do that. And I want to thank the staff of HACC as well. It's always an amazing event. And thank you, Aaron. Great job. So, I'm eternally optimistic, and it's rooted in being blessed to be a part of, helping to drive change in our state. And maybe it was a little bit Pollyannish, I don't know, but just to say, look, if we stick to the right thing and frankly, honestly, refuse to compromise when there was tremendous political pressure on us to compromise, when we thought it was a principled position, to not do that and to get it across the line and not see it as the end, but as the beginning. But, we had a lot of engagement with workers, right? But I would say the thing that really, to the subject matter today, that gives me hope is reflected in this very room, I'm not a big believer that anger is a good thing, but I think passion is incredibly important. I believe that, cheap shots are a sign of weakness and that kind of stuff. but that friction and debate and argument is where new good ideas come from. And I would brag on anywhere in here that that's how I feel when I come to an event like this. And that gives me hope. And also that we can all remain teachable. And it's an amazing world. And I mean this with all love, Cyrus, but that when you hear from a developer with that kind of message, right? There's a reason he's more popular with the trades than I am. So I only say that to have a little humor too. I'm just having fun because I think that's part of it, that we can take on these very serious things, right? But to have some humor as a lubricant, right? So I was hoping to kind of buy some laughs there at Cyrus because playing straight man, I didn't mean it seriously. But that's really important. So all that for me leads to hope. And I would say that as things get more urgent, we got to be committed, but we got to take care of each other too if we're going to take care of anyone else. And that's what gives me hope.
So, my coworkers on the Board of Supervisors joke that I'm the mom on the board, because I'm always like taking care of people and feeding folks. And I'm always the one in the middle, like breaking up the fights. But what gives me hope really is, like the next generation. I think the pro-housing movement is young. And that gives me lots of hope because I feel like, like my daughter's generation, the next generation is coming up with solutions that our generation didn't come up with. And that gives me lots of hope. I mean, I think that, 15 years ago, nobody had ever heard of the YIMBYs, or Housing Action Coalition. What is that, right? But now we are seeing this incredible coalition that is not just pro housing, but also pro environmental protection and pro density, pro urbanism, pro bikes, like all of these things that folks who have different generational expectations are creating in the world that they want to see. And that gives me tremendous hope because I think their creativity, their knowledge, their coming of age in a world that is digitally connected and fast will make for better solutions than what we were able to come up with. And I think that's great.
I'm hopeful for a lot, specifically where San Francisco is today compared to where it was a year ago. But underlying that, though, is this sort of rationalization, this moderation in our thoughts, in the debate, and sort of self-correcting a little bit, both to Myrna and to Jay's point, which is that no longer can we accept pure ideology for the basis of ideology. And I think the voters have finally started to say that loudly and showed up at the ballots, whether it's ballot measures, whether it's recalls, and so on. And I hope the same continues in November. But we can no longer politicize math and science. And if we can reintroduce logic back into discourse and show respect, not just amongst allies, but to be able to sit down with people you don't fundamentally agree with, certain colleagues of yours who I've recently met with and have respect for and have said, look, when you do something right, I criticize you for a lot, but when you do something right, I will also call out and say that was good. I think it's incumbent on all of us. And I think that having a group of people like this who are like-minded and who believe in that politics of moderation will help this city course correct. And once we get folks in office, as we have been in the last 2 to 3 years, who reflect those more broader, moderate views, I think we can finally get back to having a real conversation like we just did here. And I'm really hopeful for that. So,
With that, thank you so much, Jay, Myrna, Cyrus. Appreciate all your time and thanks for being up here. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Let's give
you,
one more
Erin.
round of applause for panelists. 2 quick housekeeping items as we all go. Number 1, if you had stuff in the green room, AIA is setting up for another event, so they moved it to a bike room. So as you walk in there and don't see your stuff, it is safe. It is in another location. Number 2, we're headed to 111 Minna right now. If you have a name tag and you are coming to the bar, bring your name tag with you because we printed out 1 name tag for you. And with that, You won't have to check in. Just right to the bar. Folks are there already. Yeah, it gets you access to the bar. That is why you're all here. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you all. Picture the five of us real quick. Yeah. Over here. Thank you. What's your name? I'm trying to get a photo of like the five. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'll give you my. Give me all the skills. I'll give you my contact. Well, name tag off for a photo. Yeah. Name tag off for a photo.